Now this is one of the best, strongest, and fastest Quill Volley Spiritborn build in Season 6. With this build you can easily clear tier 150 pits and destroy any uber bosses. This build focuses on damage, survivability, and speed to easily clear the hardest content in the game. Now this is an endgame build, so you'll need to have specific gear and will need to masterwork certain stats to push the Spiritborn to its maximum potential. And I highly recommend you to watch this video from the beginning to the end to see how everything synergizes. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you clearing a tier 150 pit. I can easily clear tier 150 pits and gain tons of experience and glyph levels. And all of my gear has only 1 or 2 greater affixes. And I don't even have the best stats on my gear. And I don't even have maxed out legendary aspects. And I can easily clear tier 150 pits. But you will need to use a mythic chest piece, the Shroud of False Death, to compensate for not having the best legendary gear and not having maxed out legendary aspects. But I find it easier acquiring this mythic chest piece than getting the best legendary gear and maxed out legendary aspects, because you can always just craft mythic gears. And what's more important than greater affixes on your gear is masterworking your gear on specific stats to greatly boost your damage and survivability. And this build is so strong that you can easily destroy huge groups of enemies and quickly shred bosses. This build can handle any uber bosses and easily beat Uber Lilith. Now one of the main source of damage for this build comes from a legendary node, the Vicious Shield legendary node, and having tons of life. So the one greater affix you'll need on all your gear is having the maximum life greater affix, and you will need to at least triple masterwork on certain stats on your gear to greatly increase your damage. Another big boost of damage is coming from stacking resolve stacks, because stacking resolve will greatly increase your block chance because of a legendary aspect, the aspect of interdiction, and combining another legendary aspect, the aspect of redirected force, which will greatly increase your critical strike damage based on your block chance, making it easy to clear tier 150 pits. And because of a legendary aspect, the Fell Soothsayer's aspect, we can easily clear groups of enemies. But for the pit bosses, you will have to fight a pit boss that summons minions in order to delete the pit bosses instantly with this legendary aspect. Now there are pieces of gear that this build requires, but 2 of the most important pieces of gear to just start this build will be the unique weapon, the Rod of Kepeleki, and a unique amulet, the Banished Lord's Talisman, farmed by defeating Duriel or Andariel uber bosses. And this is an endgame build, so you will need specific gear and need to masterwork your gear if you want to easily clear the hardest content in the game. And this build includes many skills and gear that complement each other, offering a lot of powerful combinations, but I'll cover everything in more details in their dedicated sections. Okay, so next for the skills. Now the core skill I'm using is Quill Volley, and this is our main damage dealing skill. This skill will hurl out feathers, doing tons of damage to enemies and making them vulnerable. And because of a unique weapon, the Rod of Kepeleki, this skill is also considered a basic skill, and you can freely cast this skill. The next skill I'm using is Vortex, and this skill will create a cyclone that pulls enemies. And while you have a barrier active, this skill will knock down enemies, which is really good for crowd control. The next skill I'm using is Armored Hide, and this has a passive that gains you resolve stacks, and resolve will increase your damage reduction. And when you activate this skill, you will gain unstoppable and max resolve stacks. And while this skill is active, your block damage reduction is increased for every nearby enemy. The next skill I'm using is Ravager, and this skill has a passive ability that grants you ferocity, and ferocity will increase your attack speed. And while this skill is active, your attacks will also do more damage, and you'll dash to enemies when you use your core skill and increase your vigor regeneration. And when you kill an enemy while this skill is active, the duration of this skill is increased. The next skill I'm using is Scourge, and this skill will call forth a centipede, poisoning enemies and slowing and fearing enemies around. This skill will also greatly increase your damage to crowd controlled enemies for every enemy this skill crowd controls. Now this skill is really good for greatly increasing your damage. And the last skill I'm using is the ultimate skill, the Hunter, and this skill will leap you to an area doing AoE damage to enemies. This skill will also greatly increase your ferocity, and while this skill is active, you have a chance to reset this skill's cooldown when you kill an enemy. Okay, so next for the Spirit Hall. Now the primary spirit I'm using is the Jaguar Spirit, and this states every 15th time you deal direct damage to an enemy with a Jaguar skill, unleash an additional strike dealing 15% of the damage you have dealt to them in the last 0.5 seconds. All skills are now also Jaguar skills. Now this spirit is important to greatly increase our damage to our skills and having our skills to be considered Jaguar skills to benefit from other skills on the skill tree. And for the secondary spirit, I took Gorilla, and this states maximum resolve increased by 2. When you have at least 5 stacks of resolve, you are unstoppable. Now increasing your resolve stacks is really important for this build to greatly increase your damage, and with this secondary spirit you will always be unstoppable because this build will mostly always have your resolve stacks capped out. Okay, and next for the mercenaries. Now for the higher mercenary, I chose right here to increase my damage and gain tons of survivability. And this is what I chose for the skill path. So first, Valiance will have your mercenary knock down enemies and grant you unstoppable if you're damaged at least 15% of your current life. Then I chose the skill Shield Charge, which will taunt enemies and fortify you. And then I chose right here's Guard, which will grant you 15% armor. And the next skill I chose is Provoke, which will taunt enemies and grant you damage reduction. Then I chose Mocking Lure to greatly increase my damage when Rahir taunts an enemy. And for the reinforcement, I chose Variana, and the skill I chose is Bloodthirst to greatly increase my attack speed when this skill is active, and I paired it with the ultimate skill, the Hunter. Okay, so next for the skill tree. Now this is an endgame build, so you will need certain gear to easily clear tier 150 pits. You'll need the Mystic chest piece, the Shroud of False Death, so you can get tons of life and +1 to all passive skills, which will greatly increase your damage and survivability. But I will also share a build where you don't need any mythic gear in the D4 build planner. But in order to easily clear tier 150 pits without the Mythic chest piece, you may need better legendary gear and maxed out legendary aspects, because you will be losing a lot of damage and survivability without the Mythic chest piece. So starting with the basic skills, I put 1 point into Thunder Spike and a point into Enhanced Thunder Spike, and we're just taking these skills to get to the next skill path. Next for the core skills, I put 5 points into Quill Volley, a point into Enhanced Quill Volley, and a point into Advantageous Quill Volley. And this is our main damage dealing skill. This skill will hurl feathers, doing tons of damage to enemies and making them vulnerable. And because of the unique weapon, the Rod of Kapaleki, this skill is also considered a basic skill, and you can freely cast this skill. Next, I put 3 points into Follow Through, and this skill will greatly increase your basic skills damage. And since Quill Volley will be considered a basic skill because of the unique weapon, the Rod of Kapaleki, this skill will increase Quill Volley's damage. Next, I put 1 point into Vigorous and 3 points into Balance Exertion, and this skill will increase your core skills damage, but in return your core skill will cost more vigor. Next for the focus skills, I put 1 point into Vortex, a point into Enhanced Vortex, and a point into Measured Vortex. And this skill will create a cyclone that pulls enemies, and while you have a barrier active, this skill will knock down enemies, which is really good for crowd control. Next, I put 1 point into Ravager, a point into Enhanced Ravager, and a point into Measured Ravager. And this skill has a passive ability that grants you Ferocity, and Ferocity will increase your attack speed. And while this skill is active, your attacks will also do more damage, and you'll dash to enemies when you use your core skill and increase your vigor regeneration. And when you kill an enemy while this skill is active, the duration of this skill is increased. Next, I put 1 point into Focal Point and 3 points into Apex, and this skill will greatly increase your vulnerable damage. And next, I put 1 point into Mirage and 3 points into Unrestrained Power, and this skill will greatly increase your damage while you're unstoppable. And with this build, you will always be unstoppable. Next for the defensive skills, I put 3 points into Armored Hide, a point into Enhanced Armored Hide, and a point into Reinforced Armored Hide. And this skill has a passive ability that gains you Resolve stacks, and Resolve will increase your damage reduction. And when you activate this skill, you'll gain Unstoppable and Max Resolve stacks. And while this skill is active, your block damage reduction is increased for every nearby enemy. Next, I put 1 point into Counter Attack, a point into Enhanced Counter Attack, and a point into Reinforced Counter Attack. Now we are not actually activating the skill, and it won't be in our skill bar. We are just getting the skill for the passive buffs. The passive buff will gain you dodge chance, but most importantly, it will also greatly increase your critical strike damage for every close enemy. Next, I put 1 point into Scourge, a point into Enhanced Scourge, and a point into Reinforced Scourge. And this skill will call forth a Centipede, poisoning enemies and slowing and fearing enemies around. This skill will also greatly increase your damage to crowd control enemies for every enemy this skill crowd controls. Now this skill is really good for greatly increasing your damage. Next, I put 1 point into Endurance and 3 points into Perseverance, and this skill will gain you damage reduction for each Resolve stack. And since we're stacking tons of Resolve with this build, this skill is really good for survivability. And then I put 1 point into Patient Guard, and we are mainly getting this skill to gain the 10% block chance, because increasing your block chance will greatly increase your critical strike damage due to a legendary aspect, the aspect of Redirected Force. Next for the potency skills, I put 3 points into Resilient to greatly increase my maximum life when casting a Gorilla skill. Next, I put 3 points into Brilliance, and this skill will greatly increase your Eagle skill damage based on your movement speed. Next, I put 3 points into Potent, and this skill will greatly increase your Jaguar skills damage. And since my primary spirit is the Jaguar in the Spirit Hall, all my skills will be considered Jaguar skills. And then I put 3 points into Furnace, and this skill will greatly increase your critical strike damage for each stack of Ferocity. Next for the ultimate skills, I put 1 point into the Hunter, a point into Harmonious Hunter, and a point into Exalted Hunter. And this skill will leap you into an area doing AoE damage to enemies. This skill will also greatly increase your ferocity, and while this skill is active, you have a chance to reset the skill's cooldown when you kill an enemy. Next, I put 3 points into Resolution, and this skill will greatly increase your damage to elites after casting your ultimate skill. And next, I put 3 points into Spiritual Attunement, and this skill will increase your maximum vigor if you have an ultimate skill equipped. And then I put 3 points into Supremacy, and this skill will greatly increase your damage when using your ultimate skill. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put a point into Prodigy's Tempo, and this states every third consecutive cast of the same basic skill increases all purchase skills ranks by 2 for 5 seconds. Every third consecutive cast of the same core or potency skill reduces all skills active cooldown by 10%, increased by 2% for each of their skill ranks. So because of the unique weapon, the Rod of Kepaleki, your Quill Volley skill will be considered a basic skill and a core skill. So we will greatly benefit from this key passive, gaining both the skill ranks and reducing our skills cooldown. Okay, so that's the full skill tree layout for this endgame Quill Volley build to easily clear tier 150 pits. And I will have this full skill tree layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. And I'll also share a build if you don't have the Mystic Chest piece, the Shroud of False Death, in the D4 build planner. And the skill tree will be slightly different because you are losing the +1 ranks to all passive from the Shroud of False Death Mythic Chest piece. Okay, so next for the gear. Now the gear is really important for this build if you want to easily clear tier 150 pits. You will need the Mystic Chest piece, the Shroud of False Death, if you don't have the best legendary gear and maxed out legendary aspects. And some pieces of gear you will need to triple masterwork specific stats to greatly increase your damage. Now one thing I do want to mention is that you'll need at least 1 greater affix on your gear, and it has to be the stat Maximum Life, as having as much maximum life as possible will greatly increase your damage because of a legendary node, the Vicious Shield legendary node, and will also greatly increase your survivability. And the build in the D4 build planner will have the ideal stats you want on your gear and what you want to masterwork than what I have currently equipped. So starting with the helmet, I have Dexterity, Maximum Life, and Maximum Resource, and you want the greater affix on Maximum Life. And depending on your other stats, you can switch out Dexterity for like armor. And for the tempering stats, I have Barrier Regeneration and Maximum Resolve stack. And you want to triple masterwork the Maximum Resolve stack. And the legendary aspect states, once an enemy is slowed by at least 80%, they also become feared for 3 seconds. You deal 35% increased damage to feared enemies. And we are mainly taking this legendary aspect to gain the increased damage to feared enemies, because this build can easily fear enemies around you. Next for the chest piece, I'm using the Mystic Chest piece, the Shroud of False Death. And this chest piece is really strong because it gives you tons of all stats and maximum life. And it also gives you barrier regeneration. And you want to triple masterwork the maximum life. And the unique aspect states, if you haven't dealt damage in the last 2 seconds, gain stealth and 40% movement speed. Next for the gloves, I have Dexterity, Maximum Life, and Lucky Hit, chance to restore primary resource. And the chance to restore primary resource is important to have on your gloves. And ideally you want to switch out Dexterity 4 ranks to Quill Volley, and you want to triple masterwork the Maximum Life. And for the tempering stats, I have Vulnerable Damage and Vortex Size, but you can switch out Vulnerable Damage to Overpower Damage. Just get the tempering stat with the higher roll, because Vulnerable Damage double dips your damage and Overpower Damage just has a higher roll stats. And the legendary aspect states, damaging an enemy with a basic skill grants you 4% attack speed for 10 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. Upon reaching maximum stacks, you enter a Vampiric Blood Rage, gaining 100% basic skill damage and 15% movement speed for 10 seconds. Next for the pants, I have Maximum Life, Armor, and plus ranks to basic skills. And for the tempering stats, I have Barrier Generation and Maximum Resolve stacks. And you want to triple masterwork the Maximum Resolve stacks. And the legendary aspect states, gain 10% block chance per resolve stacks. And this legendary aspect is really important because this build will have tons of resolve stacks, and gaining block chance will greatly increase your critical strike damage because of another legendary aspect, the aspect of Redirected Force. Next for the boots, I have Dexterity, Maximum Life, and Movement Speed. And you want to triple masterwork Maximum Life. And depending on your other stats, you can switch out Dexterity for like armor. And for the tempering stats, I have Barrier Generation and Movement Speed. And the legendary aspect states, Maximum Ferocity increased by 4. And increasing your ferocity stacks will greatly increase your attack speed. And next for the weapon, I'm using a unique weapon, the Rod of Kepaleki. And this is a key item for this build. And for the stats, it has Maximum Life, critical strike damage, chance for core skills to hit twice, and plus ranks to velocity. And ideally you want to double masterwork the Maximum Resource and masterwork once the chance for core skills to hit twice. And the unique aspect states, your core skills are now additionally basic skills and free to cast, but deal up to 30% reduced damage based on their vigor cost. When cast at maximum vigor, vigor. Your core skill consumes all vigor to return to full damage, cast at their largest size, and become guaranteed critical strike with 3% increased critical strike damage for each point of vigor spent this way. So this unique aspect will make your Quill Volley skill a basic skill and a core skill. And with this build, since you will have tons of vigor because of your other pieces of gear and Paragon Board, and because of your gloves, which has lucky hit, chance to restore primary resource, while having tons of resource regeneration, you will always cast your Quill Volley skill at maximum vigor, gaining its full potential damage, and always guaranteed to critically strike. Next, for the amulet, I'm using the unique amulet, the Banished Lord's Talisman, and this is another key item for this build. And the stats it has is % maximum life, attack speed, overpower damage, and plus ranks to core skills. And you're trying to triple masterwork the % maximum life. And the unique aspect states, after you spend 275 of your primary resource, your next core skill is guaranteed to overpower. Your critical strikes that overpower deal 60% increased damage. And because of our gear and the Paragon Board, we will have above 275 primary resource. And because of all the vigor regeneration, we will easily cap out our vigor when using our Quill Volley skill. So with this build, every Quill Volley cast will overpower and critically strike, allowing you to do tons of damage. And next, for the rings. Now for the first ring, I have maximum life, attack speed, and resource cost reduction. And resource cost reduction will greatly increase your damage when using the unique weapon, the Rod of Kepaleki. And you want to triple masterwork maximum life. And for the tempering stats, I have vulnerable damage and resource cost reduction, but you can switch out vulnerable damage to overpower damage depending on what stat you get a higher roll. And the legendary aspect states, when you cast an incinerate skill, enemies around you become vulnerable for 5 seconds. Killing a vulnerable enemy echoes 45% of the killing blow's damage to another nearby enemy. Now this legendary aspect is important to easily destroy groups of enemies and to instantly delete pit bosses. But when it comes to fighting pit bosses, you need a pit boss that can summon minions for this legendary aspect to take effect. And for the second ring, I have maximum life, attack speed, and resource cost reduction. And you want to triple masterwork the maximum life. And for the tempering stats, I have resource cost reduction and overpower damage. And the legendary aspect states, gain increased critical strike damage equal to 66% of your block chance. Blocking doubles this bonus for 10 seconds. And this legendary aspect is important to greatly increase your critical strike damage, because we're going to be stacking resolve stacks, which will greatly increase your block chance. And really quickly for the gems and runes. So on the helmet, I'm using the Pock rune and the Q rune, which when spending your resource, you will gain the Druid's Earthworm Bulwark skill, granting you a barrier. And this rune set is important for this build, because this is the only way for this build to gain a barrier. And having a barrier will greatly increase your damage because of a legendary node, the Vicious Shield legendary node. And for the armor pieces, I'm using Amnes gems to increase my barrier regeneration. And you want to have at least 123 barrier generation, which is important for this build to max out your barrier when you gain a barrier. And on the weapon, I'm using the Tam rune and the Zal rune, which when casting non-channeled core skill, you will greatly increase your maximum life. And on the jewelry pieces, I'm using diamond gems to increase my maximum resistance to all elements. And if you check out my armor, it's only at 782. But when running the highest tier pits, I will use potions and elixirs. And when using an elixir, I'll cap out my armor. So for the elixirs, I use Radamine Buzz to increase my maximum life, the Chorus of War to increase my stats and my damage, and Song of the Mountain to increase my armor. And for the potion, I'm using the Elixir of Fortitude to increase my maximum life. And as you can see, after using the elixirs and potion, I have 1021 armor, which is above the armor cap of 1000. And if you check out my resistance, now not all of my resistance is not capped out, but since this build has tons of life, you can easily survive any content in the game. So checking out my maximum life, I have around 26,626 life, but this is without my other buffs. So when using my skills and gaining all my other buffs, my maximum life is now at 31,951. And if you check out my barrier bonus, I'm at 127.7%. And this stat is really important. You're trying to get at least 123% barrier bonus. And last but not least, for the maximum vigor, I have 293 vigor. And ideally, you want to be around 275 vigor, so you can always use the Banished Lord's Talisman unique aspect. Okay, so I did showcase a build layout to easily clear tier 150 pits. And you'll need to triple masterwork specific stats on your gear, as it's crucial for significantly boosting your damage. And the full build layout will be in a D4 build planner linked in the description below. But I'll also have a non-mystic gear build if you're having trouble getting the mystic chest piece, the Shroud of False Death, in the D4 build planner as well. Okay, so next for the Paragon board. Now this is a fully optimized Paragon board for this build. Now ideally you'll need to be at least at Paragon level 240 to get the important nodes to easily clear tier 150 pits. Now I'm just going to quickly go over the Paragon board, going over the important nodes and glyphs, but I'll have the full Paragon board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. So starting with the starter board, I took the Spirit glyph, and the additional bonus states critical strikes increase the damage an enemy takes from you by 3% for 20 seconds up to 15%. So this glyph will greatly increase your critical strike damage. And the next Paragon board I took is Vicious Shield, and the glyph I took is Canny. And the additional bonus states non-physical damage increases all the non-physical damage an enemy takes from you by 1% up to 10% for 15 seconds. So this glyph will greatly increase your non-physical damage. And I also took the legendary node Vicious Shield, which states you do 1% increased damage for each 3% of your maximum life you have as a barrier. And this glyph is really powerful to greatly increase your damage. So this is the reason we want to greatly increase our maximum life, because when having a barrier, this legendary node will greatly increase your damage. Then heading right this way, and the next Paragon board I took is Sapping, and the glyph I took is Menagerist. And the additional bonus states dealing damage with your Gorilla, Jaguar, Eagle, or Centipede skills increase all damage you deal by 4% for 10 seconds, stacking once per spirit. So since we're dealing damage with a Jaguar, Eagle, and Centipede skill, this glyph will greatly increase our damage. But also what's important is that this glyph will increase the bonus to all magic nodes within range, and you want to increase the magic node to increase your maximum resource, which will greatly increase your damage. I also took the legendary node Sapping, which states when you cast 3 Gorilla, Jaguar, Eagle, or Centipede skills with the same spirit in a row, restore 15% of your vigor and deal 30% increased damage for 5 seconds. So this legendary node will greatly increase your damage. Then heading right this way, and the next Paragon board I took is Convergence, and the glyph I took is Fulminate. An additional bonus states you deal 12% increased lightning damage to both healthy and injured enemies. So this glyph will greatly increase your lightning damage. I also took the legendary node Convergence, which states you deal bonus damage equal to 20% of your 2 highest bonuses to damage types combined, up to 30% total. So this legendary node will just greatly increase your damage. And the last Paragon board I took is Revealing, and the glyph I'm using is Colossal. An additional bonus states you deal 2% increased damage for each stack of resolve you have, and with this build we're stacking a lot of resolve, so this glyph will greatly increase your damage. I also took the legendary node Revealing, which states lucky hit, up to a 30% chance to knock down vulnerable enemies. You deal 30% increased damage to crowd controlled enemies, and with this build you can easily crowd control enemies, so this legendary node will greatly increase your damage. And make sure you take the rare nodes and magic nodes to increase your maximum life, which is very important for this build. And also take the rare nodes and magic nodes to increase your resistance and your armor. And I also want to mention to take these magic nodes to increase your barrier regeneration, because you want to be at least 123 barrier regeneration. Now I didn't take this magic node to increase my barrier regeneration because I'm already over 123 barrier regeneration, but if you're not, make sure you take this magic node. Okay, so that's a fully optimized Paragon board for this build for maximizing your damage and survivability. And you want to get your glyphs to level 100 to maximize your damage. And like I mentioned before, I'll have this full Paragon board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, strongest, and fastest Quill Volley Spiritborn build in Season 6. With this build, you should easily clear tier 150 pits and destroy any uber bosses. With this build, you should have maximum damage and survivability to clear the hardest content in the game. This is a really fun and powerful build to play, and I'll have the full build layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Hope this helps in more Diablo 4 videos to come, so stay tuned, and of course,